The myth that the Ukraine conflict was caused by NATO expansion is the dumb story that refuses to die. But some comments from the People's Liberation Army of China reveal that China has a pretty vested interest in making sure the NATO narrative doesn't extinguish. We're going to talk about just why China is so committed to this bizarre talking point, how we know that it's a load of hooey, and what exactly the international community thinks about it. Plus, we're going to talk about the U.S.'s policy of strategic ambiguity over whether or not its weapons are allowed to be used on the border, and why the Institute for the Study of War gets it wrong. It's a whole grab bag episode. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this story is actually coming to us from the other side of the world, from Singapore, where the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is at a major security conference, right? Where there's also attendance by some senior PLA officials. Now, here's what I thought was really interesting is here's a video clip from that interaction in which a PLA colonel asks the SecDef point blank, right, that was the Ukraine conflict caused by NATO's expansion? And here's Secretary Austin's reply.
I respectfully disagree with your point that the expansion of NATO caused the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine crisis was...
Now, you might notice something interesting. And an audience focused primarily on East Asian security matters are applauding tremendously at this comment. And we're going to talk about why this is such a popular sentiment, right? But let's let him finish his comments. It's only a minute long.
Ukraine crisis obviously was caused because Mr. Putin made a decision to unlawfully invade his neighbor, who had an inferior military at that point in time. He assumed that he could very quickly roll over his neighbor and annex the country. That was 2+ years ago. He has not achieved any of his strategic objectives to this point.
Okay, now here's what's interesting about this. One, Lloyd Austin says, no, I don't think that the NATO expansion was the cause. And first and foremost, Ukraine was not close to NATO membership. They were not close in 2014. They weren't any closer in 2022. And the NATO policy, right? One, NATO's policy is anyone can apply. Russia can apply to join NATO if they wanted to. And the NATO policy also says so that technically Ukraine had just as likely a chance of membership as any other country. Kazakhstan could apply for membership. The open door policy, and it's been in place since the 1950s. And the de facto, it's an unwritten policy, is that if you want to join NATO, you have to control your sovereign territory. Why? Because otherwise, NATO would bring in a member currently at war, and it would immediately trigger an Article 5, or risk triggering an Article 5 intervention. And NATO doesn't want to sign up for that, right? You also, just for a host of logistical reasons, you can't bring in a country when you don't actually know what parts of the country are being brought in, right? It's too fraught. It's like trying to drive a car with 3 wheels, or you want to buy a car and it's only got 3 wheels. You're like, dude, no, you have to I'll buy the car when you get a 4th wheel on it, right? You're buying, you want your members to be complete countries. So Ukraine was never really there was no imminent NATO membership. There was no membership on the table. And Russia's annexation of Crimea had effectively taken that off the table 10 years ago. And here's the thing. Here's the number one thing. If you in your life encounter somebody that repeats this talking point, I will show you the counter. Here is the official transcript from the Russian government, right? From the press releases about Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson. Remember? right? A U.S. journalist, friendly to Russian talking points, sat down with Putin himself and asked him his first question. He said, Putin, you said at the outset of the war that you thought NATO might, quote, surprise attack on our country, end quote. Putin says, to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the U.S. might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that? How did you conclude that NATO was the threat that you were responding to when you invaded Ukraine, right? And then Putin says, well, that's not true. The United States was not going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. And Tucker Carlson says, well, that was a quote from you. So he says, okay, tell me then, please tell me why this has happened. And Putin, he doesn't say anything about NATO. He proceeds, you might remember, for the next 35 minutes to date back to the 8th century and says essentially that Ukraine is historically Russian lands, right? So even Tucker Carlson says, okay, after 25 minutes of Putin's history lesson, he says, okay, you are making the case that Ukraine or certain parts of Ukraine have been Russian for hundreds of years. Tucker Carlson then asked, why would you not just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons. They don't. It's actually your land. Why wait so long? And this is the part this is the lead. Putin could have said, yes, it was NATO expansion that compelled us to become involved, but he didn't. And the reason is because it's not. Because Putin's talking points, right, to his public, to the Kremlin, to the diplomatic community has always been that Ukraine is a part of Russia. That is Putin's belief, that Russia in its current form is a rump state, and that he, as the leader of Russia, right, as part of Russia's 1,000-year history that he loves to cite, has an obligation to expand Russian territory to its historic borders. And that's it. That's the answer. So, but that doesn't answer the actual question. Why is China so hung up on the idea that NATO expansion is the cause of this conflict? Well, the answer is pretty simple. This guy, this dude, Taiwan. Now, here's the thing. Many countries in the world consider Taiwan de facto or du jour an independent nation. And if you believe, if it is generally accepted by the international community that the war in Ukraine is a big neighbor invading a smaller country whom they wish to dominate and integrate, particularly one who they believe is a historically belongs to the big country, right? Do you see the parallels here? China says the same thing about Taiwan. They say Taiwan isn't an independent country. That's some fakes that Taiwan just doesn't understand. They're actually historically a part of China, and it is righting a historic wrong when if China was to invade Taiwan and reintegrate it into China. That is an important key part of the Chinese belief. The problem that China runs into is that the international community has made very clear this is wrong. It is wrong of you, the big country, to invade your smaller country, even if you think they're supposed to be a part of you. And China's nightmare scenario is to get screwed by the international community the way Russia has, right? And it's not an accident that Lloyd Austin says Russia invaded Ukraine believing it had a superior military. And China operates on a similar set of illusions. They say, oh, our military is bigger. We have a bigger industrial base, right? We can definitely roll over the Taiwanese. And the nightmare scenario for China would be if Taiwan becomes China's Ukraine, right? And so how does China need the international narrative to go? The international narrative that China needs is to say, listen, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not an analog for Taiwan. They have nothing to do with each other. They're totally different conflicts. And this is caused by Western arrogance. And that the West caused this war because they felt they needed to intervene in the politics of a big, powerful country on the other side of the world. And so if that narrative becomes true, then not only does China get permission to invade Taiwan, it actually gets to go, it's the West's fault if we invade Taiwan. It's the interventionist West with their insane commitment to not invading countries willy-nilly that's caused us, China, to invade Taiwan, right? So you see how one narrative, NATO expansion, suits Chinese interests to a T. And another narrative that Putin has expansionist desires and believes he's reintegrating his country absolutely crushes China's strategic objective of seizing Taiwan. Again, worth pointing out that if China was to get Ukraine and Taiwan, it would be a disaster. The Chinese military is already pretty shaky. The sanctions regime that Russia is subject to would cripple China. Countries for years have been pulling their industries out of China. It's now very expensive. The Chinese deflation crisis has meant that it's now cheaper to manufacture in U.S. allies like Vietnam or the Philippines. And this is just and China is in many ways surrounded by enemies, people that really hate them. The Vietnamese hate the Chinese. Many of the Cambodians, the Thais are staunch Vietnamese or Chinese enemies. Obviously the Koreans, South Korea at least, Japan. These are all powerful industrial countries that in China's worst case scenario is that they mobilize in support of Taiwan. And you might notice there were so many applause. The reason is because China doesn't only believe Taiwan is its rightful possession, right? There are islands that are owned by Korea and Japan that China believes are its own, right? I wonder, I bet there's a Wikipedia that's a list of Chinese claims, right? And territories that are, there you go. Territorial disputes of the People's Republic of China. Okay. This will tell you why there is so many applause, because China, right, like Russia, believes it owns everything, believes it owns the whole stinking universe. Okay. Right. This is just classic, like authoritarian ethno nonsense, right? Nobody's real but Chinese people. Nobody's really real but Russians. The Ukrainians are just confused Russians, or they're subordinate to Russians. They're not people in the Russian mind, just like the Japanese or the Indians or the Taiwanese aren't really people. Only the Chinese are real people, right? So, and Mandarin speaking Chinese, to be clear. But look at this. Look at all the countries that are like, yo, I have a problem with China's ambitions to annex its historic lands, right? So Bhutan borders Tibet in a border that's never been recognized, and China believes has a territorial claim on parts of Bhutan, right? China has numerous border disputes with India, the border region, a source of constant conflict. Japan, a group of uninhabited islands known as the Senkaku Islands in Japan, or the Diao Islands to China. Right, Taiwan, the entire state of Taiwan. Right, Vietnam and China have ongoing territorial disputes over the Paracels, and the South China Sea, with Chinese sovereignty, claiming sovereignty over this 9-dash line. They also have resolved disputes with just a phenomenal number of other countries, right? You might remember the 9-dash line, all this insanity, but you can see, again, the South China Sea, right? This includes all the Spratlys and the Parasols and all these other islands, right? But you can see how this is just a huge source of dispute. So that's why everyone applauded when they said, listen, Lloyd Austin came out and said, listen, the U.S., we are backing Ukraine because they have a right not to be invaded. Their sovereign territory is theirs. And even if Putin has some nonsense claim, he doesn't get to exercise it. right? The international community stands with people's right to defend their internationally recognized borders. And that's why a Southeast Asian conference was cheering for Ukraine. Okay. Now, before we talk about this strange analysis by the ISW and US's strategic ambiguity policy, I want to mention that if you don't need to maintain strategic ambiguity to get what you need done. You just need more energy. That's why I wanted to talk about Strike Gum. Strike Gum, made in the USA, 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece. To give you an idea, most caffeinated gum is packing about 50, right? This is the equivalent of an energy drink with 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further cognitive clarity. Refreshing mint flavor, right? It works out to like $1 a piece, which is so much more affordable than your typical energy drink at a gas station. That's like $5. Plus, this is made in the USA, right? Only using high quality ingredients like natural caffeine, right? That's extracted from coffee beans, right? We don't use any of the weird lab made encapsulated in lipids kind of caffeine that a lot of other manufacturers use. So check us out, strikegum.com. We also introduced our 5-pack so that you can try it out, right? You don't have to order just like 1 pack of gum, right? That's pretty inefficient. Or if you're not sure if you want to go all the way and get the efficiencies of the tray, but the tray is definitely the best deal if you're someone who loves Strike Gum. So check out the 5-pack. You can get all the discounts like military discounts and veteran discounts and new customer discounts on strikegum.com. But if you want, check us out on Amazon. You can go on, just search Strike Gum and pick some up there. And thank you to everybody that's left the reviews on Amazon because, again, it tells customers that, hey, this product, this gum, this is the USA-made, high-quality premium stuff. And everything else, a lot of it's made overseas. A lot of it's unclear ingredients, right? Sometimes it's just all made in the same factory and they slap a label on it. Not Strike Gum. It's made in Denver. I literally text the owner of the company. He's a great guy. So it's just night and day, right? Night and day in quality. So thank you guys for helping us get the word out. Okay. Here's what I thought was really interesting from the Institute for the Study of War. That they are mad because the current lack of clarity about U.S. restrictions of Ukraine's use of U.S.-provided weapons to strike military targets in Russian territory, they say misses an opportunity. And what are they talking about? Well, the answer is that some Ukrainian officials are saying, hey, we're mad because the U.S. policy, the United States said we can only strike Russian targets in Kharkiv Oblast, right? As those Russians mass and prepare to push into Ukrainian territory. The U.S. has said, listen, you can launch defensive strikes into Russian territory, but only to stop this Kharkiv incursion. And the Ukrainians are like, this is the policy, and we think it sort of sucks, right? But when they ask the United States about, for example, launching strikes on a Russian force preparing to invade across Sumy Oblast, U.S. officials said, yeah, across the border. Listen to this weird phrasing. The official says, yes, comma, across the border for Russian attacks that are coming across, comma, where otherwise Russians would enjoy relative sanctuary. If you think that's weird and unclear, that's, I think, by design, right? And the idea, first off, ISW is like, no, the U.S. must be totally clear and deter Russian preparations for offensive operations, right? And it must say Russians can't operate anywhere. But here's the thing with strategic ambiguity. It dares your opponent to raise the stakes because you're not sure, right? Russia's not certain that they won't be able to invade across Sumy Oblast. And here's the nice thing about strategic ambiguity, is that sometimes you can use it to bluff, right? You can claim, hey, you don't invade across Sumy Oblast, we'll smoke the hell out of all your guys. Like, don't do it. But sometimes you can do the opposite of a bluff. You can make somebody call your bluff and find out you were telling the truth the whole time. And I think that strategic ambiguity is something that both the U.S. and, frankly, Ukraine want to preserve. Because what would be the worst case scenario for Russia? The worst case Russian scenario would be to say, I think the U.S. is full of it. I think they are only allowing strikes outside Kharkiv, and that if we assemble an invasion force across from Sumy Oblast, we will be able to push into Ukraine unimpeded, right? Or the Sumy region, sorry, Kursk Oblast, excuse me. Sumy is the Ukrainian oblast. And the worst case now for Russia would be to gather that force, get ready to drive across the border, and boom, get hit by HIMARS, right? Learn the hardest possible way that the U.S. does actually allow strikes. So that is the worst case scenario for Russia, because the Russian invasion doesn't happen, and also the Russian military just got blown up, right? So by preserving strategic ambiguity, the U.S. might deter Russia, or even better, they might actually kill a lot of Russians and also still not let Ukraine get invaded. But that only works, right, if you're not actually bluffing, if you really do authorize it. And here's the thing. For the United States, they likely are, right? Because this is something where it's obvious that, they waited longer than they probably should have to allow Ukraine to strike these guys in Kharkiv. So makes sense then that they're not going to wait nearly as long. And the U.S. is going to be watching this border very carefully via satellite. They're going to know if Russia begins to move or assemble troops. They'll likely have some sort of authorization that just requires just a check of a box from the president, if it's not already given. So I think this strategic ambiguity is actually very much helpful to Ukraine, who wants to preserve the ability to give Russia an unpleasant surprise. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to the Colonel tier members. By the way, we're going to have a live stream tonight, 8 p.m., answering your questions, doing a tactical situation update. We're going to look at all the changes this week on the front line, plus whatever questions you guys have. So join us. You should get notification right after this. And thanks to everybody. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.